Hi, I'm Alex Zhu. Today we have Tipatat Chennavasin. Tipatat is the general partner at the Venture Reality Fund, focused on AR and VR. Before he was a VC, he was an entrepreneur who founded Big Head Mode, which was acquired by PlayFirst. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Alex. Good to be here.
Hey Tipatat, can you tell me a little bit about your story?
Sure. I don't know how far back you want me to go or where I should start, but I mean, the general gist was, I was born in Thailand, came to the US when I was two, grew up in Southern California, went to Stanford for college, worked in interactive entertainment and gaming for many, many years. Gosh, yeah, 10 plus years working at different startups. All of them pretty much failed, but to varying degrees of success. Um, And then I was working with a buddy of mine that I actually knew from college. He invited me to join a supercomputing startup he was working on. And then as that was starting to, um, you know, not work out, we were thinking about what we were going to do next. And we decided maybe we should start our own mobile game company because mobile games were becoming hot and we love gaming. I've always loved doing art. I've always loved doing animation ever since I was a little kid. I love anime um, and drawing for as long as I can remember, and just love being creative. So started 3D. I remember started 3D modeling in high school. Doing animation in Flash when that was like a thing. Doing web animation, winning some competitions there. So always loved being on the creative side of things. And so, even though I went to Stanford, I took some CS classes. I was always working on my uh, 3D art and animation skills on the side. And even though I was never formally trained, I was able to do some different jobs where it was very like art focused. So my first jobs in the industry, ranged a lot from doing kind of art production, rolling into creative director, director of design, but also doing like business side things too, like director of e-commerce and things like that. So jumping around on both sides of the art creation and then business as well. It's one of those weird things. I always say, it's like that. What jack of all trades, master of none. But I do like to bounce around and learn enough to be dangerous. But I think a lot of this too, and why I also what really served me well as being an entrepreneur was just creative or a passion for learning and trying new things and not being kind of set in my ways, and also problem solving, thinking, okay, why is this not working, and applying that not just to like creating art, but also why is the business not working, or also doing things like, especially in interactive entertainment, saying, hey, like, I don't want to just see this, I want to interact with this, and how do I do this, and not learning how to properly program, but learning enough like copy paste scripting to build prototypes. I think that's probably one of the most important things that I learned as an entrepreneur, was just building and doing whatever it takes to get a prototype, something that people can try and react to and get feedback on.
Can you share what it was like starting Big Head Mode?
Oh yeah, sure, sir. So I was kind of mentioning that. So with my good friend Richard from Stanford. I was working at his startup, but that when that was not working out, we are like, okay, what are we going to do next? We thought, oh, why don't we do iPhone gaming? And this was, back in the day, like at the very beginning of, the, gosh, like a decade ago now. And mobile gaming was about to get hot, but it still wasn't even sure, like, could you use Unity, or was Apple going to ban any third-party tools and you'd have to write native code? So we actually took the Stanford class for writing iPhone apps, and that was just terrible, at least for making games. And so we decided to just jump into Unity, and then Unity got approved. We built a prototype within a weekend. Honestly, I've got something working on the phone, and we're just like, oh my god, this is amazing! This is so easy. Let's do this. And then we started thinking, okay, well, how can we differentiate ourselves? What can we do differently? We looked at different technologies that were emerging at the time, and we thought the face recognition stuff was kind of interesting. And we thought, the Facebook social graph was very interesting. And we thought maybe combining the two and making personalized games that start you and your friends, that would take your Facebook, like with just a single sign on, just connecting to Facebook. We go into your friends' photos, scrape and grab their faces and put them on the NPC characters. And we thought that could be pretty interesting. So we built a pretty quick prototype of this. We built a gameplay prototype, then we started building all the facial grabbing tech, and then we had something rough, but what we thought was kind of interesting. Early starts. We applied to some incubators. We got into one. And that kind of gave us that, okay, yeah, maybe this is going to be a real thing. So we, got some friends and family money, and we really started down that path of trying to build a company. But even though I was working at startups, I was still pretty naive to actually running and founding a startup. I'd always been the first hire, and typically on the creative side. So even when we were thinking about, oh, maybe should we do this, I actually had left the supercomputing startup, and I joined a mobile gaming startup to kind of learn more about mobile gaming, running mobile games as a business. And so even though I was joined as a art director, I spent a ton of time with the PMs and with the execs trying to figure out, okay, how does this really work end to end, and how do you build a business, not just a game?
Yeah, the gaming industry is really tough.
It's interesting too. Like we were kind of at the tail end of the first hype cycle for mobile gaming, and it was starting to be very clear that you know uh, if you didn't have a lot of money, it was going to be really hard to compete, especially with user acquisition. And so we really for us, we started raising some real money beyond the friends and family round. Realized we weren't going to raise enough to hit our goals to really build the company we wanted. So we took a hard decision. Decided, well, maybe we should just sell the company instead. So we talked to one of our VC friends, connected us to a couple of gaming companies that were looking to do an acqui-hire. And so we ended up selling the company as an acqui-hire, instead of raising more money and trying to move forward.
Can you share some insights of the business model?
At least I'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing at mobile gaming, and what still kind of remains true at the time. But essentially, what we saw was a shift from games as we used to know it growing up, playing like a Nintendo or like console game, where games are kind of like a packaged good, where you build a game, you launch it, you sell it for $50 or whatever, and then that's kind of it. Like mobile games kind of came up with a different business model, right? Like what most people consider free to play, but what a lot of people understand is games as a service model. And the idea is that now you build a game, you launch the game, but then you spend a lot of time maintaining and updating the game, selling add-ons, and making more money through the life cycle of the game. And instead of being a kind of one-time peak, now it has like a very long tail of users and growth, and the game continues to grow over time. And so, that kind of upends the model. And now you have these huge earning revenue like possibilities from whales, people that can spend a ton of money in your game, uh, and also this idea of now like LTV, that lifetime value of the game is not just the initial purchase, but how much they're going to spend over time. And what happens is, as those lifetime values increase, then you can also spend more to acquire those customers because you know how much they're worth to you. And so this is also something kind of different about mobile gaming, and social gaming, very different from previous gaming cycles, was how you acquire users. So before it was like really just marketing, advertising, getting press mention, getting great reviews, things like that. But really with digital distribution and mobile ads in particular, and social ads in particular, they now have this way of tracking who buys your game from what ad sources. And so this accountability created this kind of performance advertising, where I could put in like $1 million for Facebook ads, and I could directly tie that to new users. And so you essentially are quote unquote buying users directly, instead of doing these kind of general television commercial. And I don't know how many users that converts. So this allowed for a lot more accountability, a lot more granularity, and a lot finer understanding of what your customer acquisition costs are going to be. And so what this really meant was, at first it was very cheap to acquire users, but then as the industry matures, like it went from like pennies then to dollars, to now on mobile it's hundreds or $100 potentially to acquire like certain types of users, quality users. And so now you get to the sense of, well, who can really pay that much for users, and the idea that you can outspend someone very easily, and drown them out and win through performance marketing. Sorry, hope that was kind of clear, but it's kind of some of the goods and then the minuses of this accountability in how we in the business of gaming or what it's turned into now. Of course, the other traditional models still work. And on new platforms like in VR and AR, it's much more like the earlier models. It hasn't gone into that kind of free to play games as a service model yet. But it's very interesting. And of course, in consoles, a lot of games are still run as regular games, not as games as services. But you can see the most profitable, most successful games companies are really running games as service companies.
So how are small game companies supposed to compete against big established brands?
Yes. I guess one very easy way to kind of look at this is if you look at the top charts in mobile gaming, it's been the same, like, top 5, top 10 games for the majority of time. Maybe like 1 or 2 games will peak and then disappear or come up and then go down. But at the top of the ecosystem, it's really been a, Zynga or Supercell, Zynga, the same big names over and over, and, Roblox and others, and Fortnite. And you'll see it's going to be bigger players. And early indie successes we saw, like Flappy Birds or Crossy Roads, those are now, 6 to 8 years ago, right? Like, we don't see that super kind of indie success anymore, or it's much less likely to happen. And also, another thing that this has kind of created, or that we've seen, is this kind of winner take all, where, like, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's like 90% of the revenue comes from 5% of the companies or something like that, right? Like, it's a very flipped model. But I would also say too, mobile gaming is so big that you can still be an indie shop and survive without having to crack the top 10 or top 100 even, right? Like, if you're in the top 500, top 1,000 even, you're probably still making millions. You're not making, hundreds of millions that Niantic will make. But, if you're a small indie studio, as long as you're making enough to, cover costs, then you're a running business. But the question is, again, how evenly distributed is that revenue? And so that's why a lot of indie developers like me went to look for new emerging platforms. I'd mentioned before, looking at new platforms and trying to figure out, okay, where is there an opportunity where the big players don't have an unfair advantage? And so the nice thing about VR in particular is it's a much smaller ocean, but the huge sharks aren't there because there's less money to be made right now. But at the same time, there's still enough money to be a successful indie startup. Another interesting fact too, I mean, I've been focusing on mobile, but I think on Steam, I recently saw some data, and oh gosh, I should double check this, but I think they said the average Steam game makes $60,000 in its first year, which is actually pretty terrible, right? Like, you can't really run a studio making $60,000 a year
Yeah.
if you have more than one employee. And even then, that's a little rough. But kind of knowing that and thinking, okay, well, what does that really mean? How does that work for others, other startups out there? Well, Facebook and Oculus just announced, okay, their new platform, the Oculus Rift or the Oculus Quest, in their ecosystem that's been around for a little over a year and a half now. They did $150 million in revenue in 1 year in software sales. And that, I think they said, it was like 35 titles had made over $1 million or more. And so I would argue that for indie developers, because there's a lot less competition, and the cost of making a successful product is much more interesting on VR and AR, where, mobile gaming, we just talked about, you need $1 million for your marketing budget to acquire users when you launch. Well, in VR, what we're seeing is most of these successful games that have made over $1 million, most of them have budgets of $1 million or less. And so
Yeah.
for the marketing budget of a mobile game, you can make a successful VR game if you have the right talent and team.
What inspired you to start the venture reality fund?
So actually, like when when I was doing my mobile game startup, I saw the Kickstarter for the Oculus Quest or for the Oculus Rift, and if John Carmack says anything is good or worth checking out, I will definitely try it, because John Carmack, is the gaming graphics legend, responsible for like Doom and so many innovations in the gaming world. And so I got the Kickstarter, I tried it out, and it really showed me that promise that VR, consumer VR, was going to come. And then I tried the DK2, which was their second developer kit, and it was much improved. It went from 3 degrees of freedom to 6 degrees of freedom, which meant that instead of just rotating my head, I could now move my head in 3D space. And it just gave this amazing sensation that's like, even though things didn't look photoreal, it felt real. And I started creating, yeah, as I like to experiment and do prototypes, what I like to call, I did some VR sketches, just brain dumps, quick 1 week hacks of these ideas I had to try out and see what makes VR unique and interesting and fun. And I built this really simple but fun demo of the movie The Matrix with a couple friends of mine. We thought, if I could go anywhere in the universe, where would I go? I wanted to go into the Matrix. And so building this demo, I accidentally conquered my fear of heights. And I mean, I created a simulation, a game, essentially, like a silly little game, and it simulated the jump program in the Matrix, where you jump across buildings and you fall like 70 stories and you bounce off the floor. And I'd always been pretty, yeah, pretty scared of heights. And then I accidentally conquered my real life fear. And it showed me that, again, how powerful VR as a medium could be. And that if, a couple people in their nights and weekends could do something so profound, imagine what millions of developers could do for billions of people. And that this wasn't going to just impact the way that we play, but could impact the way that we learn and heal and do so many other things. So yeah, once I did that, I was kind of hooked and realized, okay, yeah, this is VR is not just going to be a thing; it's going to be a big thing. And I realized too, how can I be helpful? What's going to be my contribution to the space? And after looking at what was going on, I realized, and this was during the boom, like Facebook just got acquired or just acquired Oculus. There's a lot of investor interest in the VR AR ecosystem. And talking to investors, talking to entrepreneurs, I realized the opportunity wasn't necessarily to be another startup, but maybe to be the bridge between startups and investor capital, because a lot of the early entrepreneurs didn't understand the startup founding process or how to work with investors, which I learned from doing my own startup. And then a lot of the investors didn't understand the deep tech in that was needed to create VR. And so I could bridge that gap. And that's why really my partner Marco and we decided to start this fund, the Venture Reality Fund, focused on the future of computing, which is VR, AR, and AI, to kind of think about how can we drive this medium forward? How can we bring the future sooner rather than later?
What are some of your most notable investments?
As a fund, we've done, almost 40 investments at this point. We're a $50 million fund focused on early stage, so seed and Series A. We've been active for almost 5 years now. So right before the launch of consumer VR, and about 65% of our portfolio is enterprise companies, anything from eye therapy to enterprise training to surgical navigation. But we've also had a very successful and healthy entertainment and consumer portfolio that includes some of the biggest VR games. So I'm wearing a shirt for Vacation Simulator, which was made by one of our portfolio companies, Alchemy Labs. Their first game, Job Simulator, I think was one of the first true hits in VR. I think they were the first VR game to make $9 million, I think, in VR. And it was a really scrappy team out of Austin, which they started as mobile game developers. They've been doing mobile game development for quite a while. And then they got early access to the HTC Vive. And then they built some Job Simulator, which was one of the first really true like sandbox games that had full interactivity. And it was interesting because a lot of people looked at it and it was very cartoony graphics and people didn't really understand it. They're like, oh, Job Simulator, why would I want to do these like odd jobs, like you essentially like work as a convenience store clerk, or you work as like a fast food chef, but in this, or you work as an office drone, but in this kind of like satirical, quirky style. And so it brought a lot of humor, but more importantly, it brought a lot of interactivity, and it really embraced this idea of motion controls and how important input was to VR and making a game in VR. And so, quickly became one of the most successful games. And the studio ended up being acquired by Google, and I think it was Google's first game acquisition. But our best known investment was company called Beat Games. They make Beat Saber, which is the biggest, most successful VR game. And so it was a small team out of the Czech Republic. They, created this really, really great, fun music rhythm game in VR. That's essentially, you have two light swords and you slice beats that come out, that come towards you to the music. It is one of the best games, not just VR games, but just best games, period. It's so fun. I recommend. I have yet to see anyone try it and have it not put a smile on people's faces. And it's also a fantastic workout. People have been losing hundreds of pounds playing this. But what's really impressive as an indie game story is originally developed by a team of 3 people with a budget of less than 500K. And they made 2 million, I think, in the first month. Ended up making over 20 million in its first year, and then easily double that, 40 million in its second year. And this is all just in VR. I mean, it was released for, and this was released almost like 2 years ago now. And so it was on the PC VR, is on, and then later released on the PlayStation VR, and then later released on the Quest. But yeah, again, fastest growing, fastest selling, and most played VR game, and also the most viral in terms of viewing of people playing it. The mixed reality replays, like you go on YouTube or you go on Twitch and you see people streaming it, and they do this cool like mixed reality streaming, which is essentially using a green screen and then inserting the real person into the game, and then you can watch the real person in the virtual world slicing the beats. It's fantastic. And again, what I really want to kind of point out is that kind of indie success we talked about very early on, like the Flappy Bird or the Crossy Road, right? Like, we hadn't seen a huge success like this on mobile platforms in a long time. But in emerging platforms like VR, we can see this, where a team of 3 people can make the biggest VR game in the world, and then they ended up getting acquired by Facebook. And so, again, seeing a huge outcome, seeing lives transform because they were able to design and make a very successful game. That's the kind of thing that you're like, yeah, this is a VR is a new platform, and there's going to be a lot of new, huge successes on this new platform.
Yeah, Beat Saber is pretty amazing. It's probably one of the coolest games I've seen in the VR space, especially with the lightsabers. Yeah.
It's awesome. That's especially because they just launched multiplayer, and what's really cool about it is, of course you can play with random people, but people can set up a server and you can join their server. And John Carmack, who I talked about earlier, he loves Beat Saber, is really good at Beat Saber, but he occasionally tweets out, "Oh yeah, hey, I'm doing my workout in Beat Saber. Anyone want to play?" And then you can join his server. So I actually got to play some Beat Saber with John Carmack, which is amazing. Thinking about growing up idolizing this guy and then being able to play some VR with him.
That's awesome. How has COVID impacted the VR industry?
For the most part, it's actually been, especially on the enterprise side, it's been a huge accelerator, right? Like, I think everyone kind of understands, COVID has really just accelerated a lot of these trends, like work from home, telemedicine, all these things that were, that we thought were the future now became the need to have of today. And so a lot of companies working on these things have seen huge, tremendous growth. One of our companies that does remote collaboration, remote work for the pharmaceutical industry, they're called Apprentice.io. They saw like a 7x growth in revenue. And so we're seeing huge, huge uses of this technology. But one of the things that's kind of gated it is accessibility of headsets, and that their headsets haven't been widely distributed yet. And that COVID actually impacted the manufacturing of headsets too. So things like, the Oculus Quest for a long time, it was just out of stock and hard to get. And so for the most of this year, like especially on the consumer side, we saw a lot of usage for people that had the VR headsets, but we didn't see a lot of adoption of new VR headsets because they couldn't actually buy any. But fortunately, now that's changed. Oculus has just released the Oculus Quest 2. I think they released it last week, and we've seen it have anywhere from a 3 to 10x impact in terms of usage or sales for some of the VR startups selling game software out there. So the one part though that VR has impacted, or that COVID has impacted negatively, was the location-based entertainment space, which is like kind of the VR arcades or VR in theme parks, because of course arcades, theme parks, they've all been shut down. So aside from that though, it's been pretty tremendous how impactful it's been, because not just in terms of actual usage, but also interest and of people kind of understanding, again, this isn't just a work from home. A lot of companies now, like Microsoft, are saying, hey, we're going to now allow a large part of our workforce to permanently work from home, even after we have vaccines and after the pandemic is over.
Where do you see VR heading in the next 5 years?
It's always hard to tell, but what I think is really interesting is, I think it's just growing at such a huge fast pace, right? Like it's still very early in the VR AR space. Like I said, Oculus Quest, right? Like they said, they $150 million spent in software, in a year and a half, right? In 5 years, I expect that number to be more than 5x, easily like 10x or more, right? Like I think what I see right now, okay, or maybe a better way to put this is, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, before the VR launch, we're like, okay, when is the first company going to make $1 million? That was easily within a couple months of VR being launched. When's the first company going to make $10 million? That was easily within a couple years. When's the first company going to make $50 million? That was within 3 years. When's the first company going to make $100 million? That's probably going to be the end of this year, which is about 4 to 5 years in VR launch. So when are we going to see the first VR companies making 500 million or $1 billion in revenue? I think we're easily going to see that within 5 years easily. The other thought, is thinking about, okay, well, is this going to be mainstream? Will VR, AR be mainstream within 5 years? I think that's a little harder to answer, because I think the definition of mainstream keeps shifting. Is mainstream 10 million units? Is mainstream 100 million units? Is mainstream billions of units? I expect, honestly, that VR should reach, tens of millions of units for the next couple of years. Within 5 years, not sure if it'll get to 100 million, but what's more important is that the revenue will be there for companies that are building stuff. And the use cases are going to be very diverse. Like I've been spending a lot of time talking about gaming, but like I've said, like, surgical navigation, already millions of people are training, like Walmart trains millions of people in VR right now today. And I think we're just going to see that grow and grow and grow. And what I think is really interesting is understanding what this means for the average worker and the average way that we work or the way that we learn. And I think right now, through the pandemic, we're all figuring out, okay, we can reinvent this new future that we're going towards, and it doesn't have to be the old norm. It can be a better norm. And I think VR and AR will play a big role in that.
What are some of the unique use cases you see in the VR space?
I have a friend that's getting married in Thailand, a really good friend of mine, and I was supposed to be the best man, but I can't fly to Thailand anymore. But so instead of the expensive airline ticket, I'm actually buying a bunch of headsets for us and the other groomsmen. We're going to do a virtual bachelor party. We're all going to go in and play some VR games together, which is great because a lot of the friends are spread out, not just throughout like the US, but like again internationally. And so the idea that we can all be playing games, but like really hanging out, high-fiving, and just feeling like we're there with each other, I think is going to be fantastic. And the fact that, again, the Oculus Quest just came out and it starts at $299, which is just insane. It's so cheap to get really great VR experiences. I never would have thought it would have arrived this quickly at so cheap a cost, especially considering less than a decade ago, good VR headset system, used by the government and the military was like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the Oculus Quest doesn't need an extra computer. It's all in one, which means the compute is in the headset. So here, I'll show you. This device, it has the compute and the sensors all built in. So you don't need external sensors to set it up. You don't need an external computer or a game system to connect it to. And it can run a lot of great VR content.
Oh wow.
So and again, all in one. Like you don't have to, like, aside from buying the software, of course, but you don't have to buy extra hardware, and you can get a great VR experience up and running in less than a minute, and it's amazing.
That's really affordable now. That's crazy.
Like 4 years ago when VR launched, right? You needed a gaming PC, which was $1,000, and you needed a headset that cost like $500, right? So $1,500 to do some VR, and it was hard to set up. And now all of that friction's gone. Really great games out there. Yeah, it, the time for VR is definitely now.
Are there any VR games you recommend?
So definitely, like, on the quest for an all-in-one VR experience, I definitely recommend Beat Saber that I talked about, Job Simulator, Vacation Simulator. There's a great social game, so if you want to play with friends, called Rec Room, has a bunch of different mini games, and you can actually build your own games inside for other people to play. So that's really cool. It's kind of like a Roblox of VR in a certain way. Then there's a great action adventure game called Lies Beneath. But then a great puzzle shooter game called Super Hot. Actually, I can go on and on. There's just so many great titles. Pistol Whip is another great kind of music rhythm shooter game out there. Um, what else have I been playing a lot? Yeah, there's so many games. But I will say too, we've been talking a lot about like mobile PC, and even with the Quest, you can still connect it to a powerful gaming PC if you have one, and you can play different, more powerful games. And on the PC VR game side, definitely I would recommend Half-Life Alyx. It is the best VR game, bar none, in terms of like what we would think an action adventure horror game could be. It's a triple A. I think it's truly the first triple A built for VR game out there, made by Valve. Half-Life has always been one of the most important gaming franchises. It was one of the first to introduce, story-driven first-person shooter. Then it was the first to, bring in physics-based interactions in a shooter game. And now with Half-Life Alyx, it's really the first to bring in full immersion into that kind of first-person shooter genre. And it is a masterpiece. And then also another great one, if you have a PC VR setup, is Star Wars Squadron. So a lot of people, if you ever watch Star Wars, you've always dreamed about jumping in an X-wing. Yeah, this is the game that lets you do that, and it looks amazing and plays amazing, and it is definitely some of the most fun you can have, like Star Wars fun that you can have anywhere, like even beyond, I think, what they're doing with the Star Wars theme parks. So yeah, those are some of the games I'd recommend. But the other thing I'd really recommend for people using VR, and one of the things I love the most about VR, and maybe I'm biased because you mentioned my art background but making art in VR is fantastic. Painting with light in 3D space is just magical and relaxing, and a way of unwinding that I can't get enough of. And there's a great app called Tilt Brush by Google. It's available on the Quest. It's available on PC VR. It's even available on PlayStation VR. And you can just paint a forest and walk through your forest. Like, it's crazy. It's beautiful. So I definitely recommend checking out not just games, not just the movies and storytelling pieces, but also thinking about creation and art, and using VR as a tool.
I've tried paintbrush before. I was blown away by drawing twirls around.
Yeah, even just drawing twirls. I mean, it's just fun, right? You're just like, oh yeah, it just makes art almost like a performance, right? Like a physical performance. It's cool. Oh, the other thing I wanted to recommend too for VR, especially during these COVID times, if you have PC VR, Google Earth is fantastic in VR. I don't know if you ever got to try it, but yeah, I used to travel so much for my job, and in some ways I miss going to places or seeing places, and so going back and revisiting them using in Google Earth is amazing. It's not like Google Street View. They actually take the satellite images and do photogrammetry to create 3D models, and you actually walk around and you feel like you're flying around or Godzilla-ing through these like cities and places, and it's amazing.
I've never tried that, but I have to check it out. It seems really fun though.
Yeah, it's super cool.
What do you think of using VR to trade stocks?
I've actually been pitched that several times. I think for a long time the gating factor was the resolution. Is the resolution good enough? But I would say now with the new Quest and other high resolution headsets like the HP Reverb G2, you get good enough resolution that you could actually do things like that. So yeah, I can easily see the Quest. You look at the resolution and it looks great. Text is super readable. It's so much better and so much cheaper than having, 6 monitors up, right? And I think what's really interesting too, though, is going beyond just you know, what we have today with the 2D world and really engaging our visual and spatial memory. And I think that could result in some really interesting things. We have a company that actually is called Virtualytics, and they do data visualization in VR. And it's easier to spot trends or notice particularities in large sets of data using VR for visualization. And so, yeah, I can see that being very applicable towards fintech.
How is VR being used in the medical field?
There are a lot of great healthcare use cases for VR. Of course, training is one of the most obvious ones, and especially during COVID, we've seen a lot of people like need to be trained on some of the newest protocols in a very safe way, and so VR lets people do that. But then also, what I was talking about too was therapy and treatment, and I think that's really the most profound aspect, especially for like mental care or mental health. There's a lot of things that VR can treat, and like my own personal overcoming phobias is definitely one. Pain management is another big one as well. But then we invested in a company called Vivid Vision that does eye therapy, and improves your eye health using VR. And then we've also invested in another company called Propria, which does surgical navigation using VR and AR. And this idea of, if you have a 3D reconstruction of the human body like through the scans, can you tie it to the real physical body while you're doing the actual surgery? And the short answer is yes, you can, and you can get much better outcomes, reduce surgical error, reduce surgery time, which again increases patient recovery rate and all those kinds of things.
Can you walk me through an example of how VR is used to treat trauma?
Immersion therapy, it's been studied very, very well for the past like 20, 30 years. And a lot of the times it was just impractical to do, like conquering people's fear of flying, right? Like you can buy them airplane tickets and then they have to sit there and feel comfortable and then remove them before takeoff. Like, just that stuff is just so impractical to do. But now in VR you can actually do it in a way where it triggers that same, give them that stimuli of being an airplane, and you can actually properly manage and understand and walk them through each of the different scenarios and run infinite scenarios with them at the press of a button, right? You're like, oh, maybe it's turbulence that really puts them off, or oh, maybe it's the act of taking off that puts them off, or and really understand, because again, everyone's phobia manifests itself kind of, or it's triggered differently, and so understanding the triggers helps better understand how to treat and deal with it. So that's kind of a very rough way of explaining how the kind of some of the immersion therapy works. But then some of the other stuff like the eye training is very interesting actually. So I'm sorry, the eye therapy. So what's with ambliosis, the idea of like lazy eye, one eye is weaker than the other. Right now, the current way to strengthen your eye is or to look at a piece of paper and it tells you these eye exercises: look up, look down, look left, look right, all these kinds of things, right? The problem is, it's just not super engaging to do, and it's hard to really tell, if it's working, and there's ways people shortcut, right? Like if you don't completely cover one eye, your other eye compensates. And so what's great about VR is, you have two like screens going to each eye, and it can actually say, okay, you know what, if one eye is weak, the other eye is strong, it can turn off the vision for the strong eye and really force you to use your weak eye. And then it can make interactive games, and the performance can be personalized over time, and it can really test and understand how you're doing throughout the process and give you that feedback, gamifying it and giving you encouragement. And so those are the reasons why you get more successful outcomes. And so what's really interesting was, right now, so the state of art, like I mentioned, was just that, the physical paper test, right? Or the physical treatment. And that works about 40% efficient and only works for juveniles. When you become an adult, for some reason, those tests no longer, or that treatment option no longer seems to work. Well, in VR, with a study, they found that it's 60% effective, but more importantly, it treats adults as well as juveniles. So adults who usually were not able to be treated now have a treatment option that's really impactful.
How are music festivals adopting VR?
So this is interesting. Like one way to think about like how VR is impacting the music industry in particular. It's not so much the consumption side because again, there's just not enough headsets to make it super compelling to be like, hey, you know, I'm a music artist. I want to do a concert. I can reach, there's tens of millions of people in a VR headset. Maybe I can reach like 50% of them, or I can go in Fortnite and reach you know 11 million people live, or I think it was 15 million people live concurrently, right? Like that's what's possible if you go in and create and use a virtual concert platform like a regular 2D game. But so these virtual concerts are happening, but they're not happening in VR yet because the audience isn't there. But they're happening in places like Fortnite, places like company we invested in called The Wave. They just threw one of the largest virtual concert on TikTok with The Weekend. And now we saw like Roblox, they announced they're focusing on virtual concerts as well. So we're seeing definitely a huge growth in virtual concerts. But what's really interesting is that the VR is more used behind the scenes as a production tool to help create the sets, or AR tools being helped to animate the characters, kind of doing what I'm doing. Like I just attended a virtual YouTuber concert in Japan, and it was fantastic. So yeah, these things are happening. They're using VR and AR tools, but the consumption is still kind of in this kind of 2D flat way for now because that's where the audience is.
Till there's mass adoption of headsets, you can't really reach as many audience.
Yeah, but what's really cool though is, I mean, even you know having a 2D concert, but a virtual concert in the 2D world is still super helpful for artists and for the audience, right? Like it's they're creating these really cool experiences. Definitely check out the Wave or wavexr.com. They host so many super cool concerts. They've been throwing benefits with like um, John Legend, raising a lot of money for charities, but with these cool virtual concerts that you can watch on YouTube and Facebook and Twitch.
VR is pretty amazing. Once you try VR, you'll understand.
You just got to try it. Just put on the Quest 2 headset, right? Like it's like seeing is believing, and it's you can't just talk about it. You got to really experience it. But yeah, but it's so good.
Is there anything else you would like to share?
Sure. I mean, well, first, of course, the easiest way to find me is just online on Twitter. I'm pretty active. I'm, at Tipatat, Tipatat. The other thing, our website, of course, is www.thevrfund.com. And I'm always looking to, invest in startups that are working on VR, AR, AI. And so, you can reach out to me at my email, Tipatat, Tipatat, at thevrfund.com. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm just really excited. Like, if you guys haven't tried VR or you haven't tried VR in a long time, definitely ask around, try to find a friend that has a Quest 2, and check it out. I swear you'll be blown away. And, honestly, get one. It's just the most fun that you can have right now. Um, yeah, and if you get it, add me as a friend, and then we can play some Beat Saber together.
Awesome. Thanks, Tipatat. Thank you for your time. We'll chat soon.
Okay, thanks, man. Everyone, take care. See you all in the metaverse.